trial came back into the news. Arch City defenders and their lawyers helped this guy out, and finally all of the charges were dropped. Tony Messenger, STL Post-Dispatch columnist. Good morning, Tony.
Good morning, McGraw. Good morning, Kelly.
Hi, Tony.
You've been talking about this Fred Watson guy for a while. Take us through give us a little primer and tell us what happened.
Yeah, so I met Fred about a year ago, and that was 4 years after he was arrested in Ferguson at Forestwood Park after playing a game of basketball. And he was just sitting in his car, and a police officer came over and asked him for his ID and said that his windows were tinted, that his plates were out of state, which they were, but they were properly licensed. Anyway, Mr. Watson says, let me get my license. And the guy just cuffs him and takes him in and charges him with, and this is all in the police reports, charges him with not having a license, not having insurance, having illegally tinted windows. And none of those things are true, and they're all verifiably true and are verifiably untrue. And so when he gets to the police station, he then complains to the chief or some higher up about his treatment by this police officer, a gentleman named Eddie Boyd, who had been a city police officer and was one of these police officers who was caught in what we call in St. Louis the Muni Shuffle. He was basically drummed out of one department because of multiple complaints against him and ended up in Ferguson. And so Fred Watson complains, and they add more charges to him. Now they're accusing him of failure to comply and all of this. So they get all these charges against him. Here's the problem. He's a defense contractor who works for the NGA and has a security clearance. And as it's been explained to me by Fred and multiple others, when you have a security clearance, a high one like he does, you can't cross the street without looking both ways. You get something on your credit report, you might lose your security clearance. They watch these guys all the time. So Fred did exactly what he was supposed to do. He went into work the next day. He said, look, I got arrested. I got these charges against me. They're bogus. I will get them cleared. And let his bosses know. And he was trying to clear his name the entire time. Hired two different attorneys before he got Arch City defenders, and Ferguson would just not listen to him. So 2 years into it, the DOJ comes, Department of Justice, during the Michael Brown Ferguson protest. And he's one of the stories in the DOJ report when the DOJ said, look, Ferguson has some problems dealing with black people, that it's got some racism, it's got some problems in its police department and its municipal courts. And Fred's story was in the DOJ, but it was anonymous at the time until he spoke to me, and I wrote about him with his name for the first time in 2016. Anyway,
So the story goes. Just this week, they finally, after all this time, have dropped all the charges.
After all this, they dropped. But here's how ridiculous it is. So when I started writing about him, Arch City defenders had filed a motion in the Ferguson court to say, look, we have evidence that said he never pleaded guilty. You guys just said that he pleaded guilty and took the money that he had posted for bond. He never pleaded guilty. They had two different attorneys saying it never happened. Ferguson had no evidence that he had ever pleaded guilty. I was in court that day when the previous prosecutor, Stephanie Carr, fought the charges. So they're fighting him. Arch City defenders and Fred Watson, they win at every step of the way. So after they allow the guilty pleas to be withdrawn, you're now several years later. There's no evidence that he committed any of these crimes. You would think Ferguson's response would be, okay, we screwed up. Let's let this thing go. No, they refiled the charges. And this thing was supposed to go to trial last week. It gets delayed. And then all of a sudden this week, the new prosecutor, Lee Goodman, says, okay, we give up. No charges. He's free. Nothing on his record. But in the meantime, it's 5 years later. He's lost his house. He's lost his job. He's lost his security clearance. And getting it back is not going to be easy.
This guy's life is in shambles.
It is. And he has a federal civil rights lawsuit against Ferguson. And as I said in my column, I think he's going to win that thing and ultimately Ferguson's going to have to settle and at least give him some financial remuneration for what they did to him. But this is yet another example, and it's a big one, of how the municipal court system in St. Louis County, with all of these small municipal courts and police departments, and being used by the cities basically to raise money more than to serve justice, is still a problem. We're 3 years after Ferguson, and there have been some minimal reforms, but they aren't significant. And these courts still exist, and they still exist primarily to raise money for cities. And until we do something more seriously in terms of reforming these municipal courts and get them operating the way our circuit courts do, where individual defendants have the full set of rights that the Constitution provides for them, then we're going to have these stories again 3, 4, 5 years down the road.
You know, the sad part of this is Fred Watson's the lucky one, because he got the attention of Arch City Defenders. He got the attention of you, right? He got the attention of the press. But how many others go through this who don't have access to all those resources?
Well, and this is a point Fred made, and he's also lucky in that, and he's well aware of this. He says to me, look, when this happened, I had money. And so when it happened, he was able to fight it and fight it and fight it. Now, it ended up costing him his job and costing him the money that he had saved through a life of working. The guy was a veteran of the Navy. I mean, he knew how to put money away. He had means. And look at what they did to him. And then think about all of the poor people that they do this to, who don't have means, who just end up in jail because they can't pay the fines. They don't have either the money or the sophistication to go get an attorney. That's one of the important points Fred made to me as to why he's continuing to do this. He wants people to recognize that it happens to people of lesser means all the time, and their stories are worse than his.
Tony Messenger, good stuff. Thanks for checking in.
Good to talk to you.
Every Tuesday, every Thursday with us.